So I want to talk with you this evening about some work we've been doing for a number of years on emotion, response, and regulation, particularly in long-term Zen and mindfulness meditators. And some of you have heard bits and pieces of this before. We started doing this work probably now about 7 or 8 years ago. And it was very slow and laborious in accruing data. And also we did some things I'll tell you about this evening that took a terribly long time to actually analyze. And so we're really just now getting around to combing through a lot of the data. Much of this is exploratory. So we had some very hypothesis-driven stuff that I'll tell you about. But much of it was really to try to begin to map out what is it that goes on in emotion and emotion regulation as people progress over relatively long times in meditation. Not from a longitudinal perspective, because nobody has the time to follow people for 30 years, but from a cross-sectional perspective where we look at people of varying amounts of meditation experience. So I think, as many of you know, within the Buddhist tradition and in a number of other contemplative traditions as well, emotion actually plays a very core role, and I would make the argument that a great deal of what it is that we practice is the transformation of emotion and emotion response. So within Buddhism, the so-called Brahma-viharas, or 4 sublime emotions or sublime abodes, loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. And I would note that if you look at current ways of defining wisdom, you find that this kind of terminology really comes up over and over again in what is considered to be wise action and wise thought. There's a fair amount of empirical research now that's going on, and I'm just kind of highlighting a few different domains of that, having to do with mindfulness and emotion. So a few of the relevant observations: dispositional mindfulness has been found to be related to greater prefrontal, upfront cortical activation, and proportionately reduced amygdala activity, the amygdala being a structure that is very important in vigilance for self-relevant events in the world and control, particularly of cascades of emotion response to those events. And that occurs particularly during affect labeling, the sort of thing that's often done in mindfulness or vipassana practice of noting and labeling the events in one's mind stream, including emotional events.
Are you okay with questions as we go, or do you want us to wait?
I'll tell you what, if they're clarification questions, something that just doesn't make sense, then yes, otherwise...
Would it be quick to say what dispositional mindfulness is?
Yes, dispositional mindfulness simply means, rather than looking at effects of training, it uses a questionnaire approach typically to rank order people in degree of self-reported aspects of mindfulness. And so, without meditation experience, people will vary along some continuum of mindfulness in day-to-day life. But let me just also add, it's a very contentious topic. There's a lot of discussion in literature about whether or not we have adequate measures of that. Studies showing mindfulness training resulting in greater activation, visceral and somatosensory brain areas that are associated with body sensation during induced emotion, particularly sadness, in this study of Fard and colleagues published a couple of years ago. And then we've got things like mindfulness-based cognitive therapy being shown to reduce depression relapse, also, of course, emotionally relevant. So a lot of activity going on. In our own research program, we really were most interested in trying to get a fundamental understanding of what happens in emotion response and in the regulation of emotion. And our overall hypothesis was that the quiet, open attention to the mental continuum, whether that's in Zen or mindfulness meditation practice, over time allows for a shift from attachment, that is a clinging to positively valenced experiences and pushing away or repulsion from negatively valenced experiences, and the emotional reactivity that comes of that, to a more equanimous state, a more balanced emotional state, and a state in which there is faster recovery once emotion is aroused. And I'll unpack some of that in a bit. We published a study in 2006. Liz Nielsen, my graduate student then and now colleague at the National Institute on Aging, in which we designed a study. We were very concerned that a lot of what was going on using self-report kinds of measures was liable to a number of demand characteristics that made it difficult to interpret that data. So you can imagine if you've been meditating for 20 years and someone asks you, are you calm and equanimous, you're not likely to say no, unless you feel like you've been wasting your life all of that time. So we wanted to try to get at this in some other ways, particularly ways that would give us a little finer-grained look at what happens fairly early on in the processing of emotionally salient events. So we studied two groups of individuals, a group of non-meditators and a group of long-term meditators, 12 to 29 years of continuous practice. We showed them pictures, and I'll give you examples in just a moment. We showed them to them in one of two conditions. Everybody got both conditions. Either non-masked, that is, you can see it, you're consciously aware of what the image is, and masked, a way of manipulating the exposure and what happens before and after the image so that we prevent people from being able to be consciously aware of seeing anything. And we use pleasant, neutral, and unpleasant images. So this is an example of the non-masked condition. They focus on a central fixation point for 4,000 milliseconds. Then for 3,000 milliseconds, they see an image, an emotionally salient image. And these are all, as I'll explain in a moment, so-called biologically prepared images. In other words, things that are either positive or negative, not on the basis of some learning history, but presumably on the basis of our evolutionary history. 4-second pause, and then a rating using this pictorial schema for rating both valence. It's a little hard to see from farther away than where I am, but this is a kind of smiley figure to a very frowny figure, so positive to negative valence, and also arousal, a very quiescent image here to a very agitated image. And then also we inquire about whether the person was able to see the picture, and unless they fell asleep or died for this non-masked condition, they would always be yes. For the masked condition, same kind of setup, fixation cross, but then the first thing that happens for 45 milliseconds, there is a scrambled image. We just put these together in Photoshop by really cutting up the various emotional images that we have, but making sure that there is no identifiable feature within them. 45 milliseconds of exposure of the image, here a positive one, and then followed for the rest of that 3-second interval by a mask again. Same pause, rating, valence, and arousal, and again asking whether the person could see the picture. In almost all cases, individuals in this condition say no, and in the two instances where the person said they could see something, they were dead wrong about what it was. So we use two sets of images that come from the International Affect Picture Series. These are images that have been used with large samples of persons so that we have normative data that tells us what people experience in viewing them in terms of arousal and valence. We select those, as I said, that are biologically prepared in content: neutral, low arousal, unpleasant, high arousal, pleasant, high arousal, and then some catch items. These are just masks, so we can have a sense of whether people are false alarming to something that really isn't there. We match the pleasant and unpleasant on valence and arousal. we matched the two sets of stimuli and valence and arousal norms, two sets because we do these at two different testing occasions. And then the stimulus types as well as the masks for each type are matched for luminance. Important because luminance of a stimulus can be emotionally arousing itself, so you have to be careful about that. And that took us about a year to simply do the work of selecting those stimuli, matching the luminance, all of that stuff. Examples of what the unpleasant emotional images look like. Some of them are threat kind of images, some are sadness kinds of images. The dependent measures from the physiologic perspective, skin conductance response and facial electromyograph. So we record in a standard fashion from the palmar surface of the fingers to obtain a skin conductance response. And we record from both the zygomatic as well as the corrugator regions of the face in order to obtain very subtle electrical changes that happen with either smile muscle activation or frown muscle activation. Now note that very seldomly can you actually observe a visible smile or frown. So these are very subtle changes, and that's why we use electromyography, because after all, we're having people sit in a chair in the laboratory viewing images. It doesn't float many people's boats, but we can certainly see the changes physiologically. That's what the raw data looks like. Here's a skin conductance response in the topmost trace that occurs. Here's where the stimulus onset was. It's an unpleasant picture, and what you can see is there's an activation in the right and left corrugator muscles, the black and the blue, whereas not much change at all that happens within the zygomatic region, characteristic of what we see when it's a negative image, and the reverse, what we see when it's a positive. So what did we find in this study? And I apologize for going over it rather quickly, but in large part it's because it's already published. You can look it up. And also, I've talked about this before, but I really want to get and spend more time with some of the other stuff. The long-term meditators and the non-meditating controls showed very similar profiles in their self-reported emotional experience. So as we anticipate, they report more pleasant experience in response to the pleasant images, and more unpleasant experience in response to the unpleasant images, neutral in between. Similarly with arousal, both of the groups demonstrating higher self-reported arousal experience to the positive and the negative in comparison to the neutral. For the non-masked pictures, we also find similar physiological responses to these images. So skin conductance, again going along with arousal self-report, higher for the positive and negative in comparison to the neutral. And for the corrugator, I'm just showing the left side of the face here, a larger response to the unpleasant images, and for the pleasant images, higher response of the zygomatic region. So nothing surprising there, and no differences between those groups. Where we began to see differences was in response to the masked pictures, and because the data pattern is a little more complex, I'm just going to kind of step through it verbally rather than showing you a lot of graphs. First of all, the long-term meditators rated the masked unpleasant pictures as less negative than did the controls. So their self-reported experience is less negative to those images. And remember, they can't report having seen anything. So it takes a little bit of training, because people say, crazy, I didn't see anything. What do you mean? Am I feeling pleasant or unpleasant? Well, you say, guess. There's no overall group or picture type effects for skin conductance or for facial EMG. In the meditator group only, for those who self-report higher emotional clarity, and I'll tell you in a couple of minutes how we measure that, but it is correlated with their years of practice. There's a lower physiological, that is skin conductance response, as well as lower self-reported experienced arousal for both the masked and the non-masked emotional pictures. So the degree of clarity and years of practice seem to have something to do with those decreased arousal responses. And finally, the long-term meditators who report higher emotional clarity also show greater zygomatic electromyographic response in the masked condition. They tend to have more activation across stimulus types of the so-called smile muscles. So we wanted to try to understand in more detail what might be going on. What are some of these subtle differences that we're seeing in the masked condition about? How is meditation practice over time related to changes that might, by other kinds of measures, shed some light on what it is that we're seeing from that picture paradigm? So we took a look at a larger group of meditators, including an addition of a small number that had a short-term meditation practice, 4 to 7 years, and compared them to non-meditating controls and the long-term meditating group. They're equivalent in age, in their early to mid-50s, in their educational backgrounds, all quite well educated. And we didn't find any difference in terms of practice style, mindfulness versus Zen, but I note two things. Number one, very small sample sizes, and secondly, they're all lay practitioners, and the particular mindfulness teacher tended to mix Zen and Vipassana traditions in the approach to meditation teaching. So we had 2 sessions. In one of those sessions, separated by a week, there was a videotape structured interview of recalled emotional experiences. We asked people to recall pleasant and unpleasant experiences that they've had, and we record heart rate variability following that interview, and we administer some instruments, self-report instruments, very extensive questionnaires that give us indices of attention to emotion and clarity. Again, I'll unpack that in a moment. Second session, we measure heart rate variability without preceding it by this structured interview and recalled emotional experience. And then we also follow that by a heartbeat detection task, a way of looking at sensitivity to bodily signals, interoception. So these measures of attention to emotion and emotional clarity we borrowed from some work done by Carol Gohm and Jerry Clore, in which they examined and factor analyzed on a quite large sample a number of different measures that have something to do with awareness of one's emotional experience. The factor that they labeled as attention to emotion, they described it as extent to which persons monitor their emotions, value their emotions, and maximize their experience of emotion, contained a number of second-order factors comprised of items from these various instruments and measures. Emotional clarity, which they described as ability to identify, distinguish, and describe specific emotions, had itself another second-order set of factors, again derived from various of these measures. Quite long inventory that took people well over an hour to complete. So what do we observe in these things? Well, using these attention and clarity emotion measures, first of all, for attention, while there were no significant differences between the groups because of substantial variability, you can see that nominally the short-term meditators' average is higher. It's negatively correlated with age. The older you are, the less attention to emotion or interest in emotion that you're reporting, at least in this sample. And it's negatively correlated with heart rate variability measures. And I'll tell you about those measures again in just a few moments. But we use them as ways of indexing parasympathetic nervous system activity that we think is involved in the regulation of emotion. So interesting that it's negatively correlated with age and negatively correlated with heart rate variability. For the clarity measure, the long-term meditators are significantly higher than are the controls, and the short-term meditators don't differ from the controls. Years of meditation practice is positively correlated with clarity. So the longer the practice, the greater the self-reported clarity. Not true for attention to emotion. And that'll become important when we look at relation to other variables. How do these two measures relate to each other? Well, in the controls, there's a moderate and significant relationship, a correlation coefficient of 0.5. That's the blue line here, positive correlation. For the short-term meditators, now remember it's only 5 individuals, so I was quite surprised that the relationship was as strong as it is, and you can see that the 5 line up along a linear function almost exactly. That correlation coefficient jumps up to 0.99. For the long-term meditators, it's a non-significant negative correlation. So just don't chew on it too much, but just kind of know that the two meditation groups are dramatically differing in this relationship between the attention and clarity measures. Some other observations, and I'm going to try to pull all these together momentarily. Compared to controls, long-term meditators tend to report being better at repairing their moods. When they become upset, they say, well, it's easier for me to return to baseline or equanimity. And they also report less public self-consciousness in regard to emotion and emotion expression. The long-term and short-term meditators have lower scores on the Beck depression inventory than the controls, but cautionary note, it's not predicted by either years of meditation practice or any of the other self-assessed emotional abilities, so we don't really know what that means, and I think absent any relationship to years of meditation practice, maybe all it means is that people who are less depressed tend to get more interested in meditation or stay with it for longer. The interviews that were done, we asked people to freely describe one strong positive and one strong negative emotion experience from the past 6 months. The experiment assistant then, who is a long-term meditator herself and trained to do this kind of probing, asks individuals to elaborate on their experience in regard to thoughts, feelings, action impulses, and actions. And we use that kind of a coding schema derived really from general theories about the components of emotion. The content gets transcribed and coded by 2 independent raters. The kappas, the inter-rater reliability coefficients for these categories, were all at or above 0.80, so seem to be able to be reliably rated. So what do we find? Just some of the highlights from that. We're still combing through those analyses. The short-term meditators seem to be the ones that are focusing more on bodily feelings in their report when they describe these emotional experiences. So there's a significant group main effect with the short-term meditators scoring more highly than the controls on that derived measure. It's correlated with attention to emotion from that questionnaire measure that I described to you previously. And it's negatively correlated with years of practice. The greater your number of years of practice, the less your tendency to report bodily experience in these emotional experiences of the past 6 months. This heartbeat detection measure, basically we record the electrocardiogram, and every time there's a QR wave, it triggers a sound, and we either have that sound be exactly coincident with the person's heart rate, or we stretch or shrink it so that it's not coincident with the person's own heartbeat. And for blocks of trials, individuals have to estimate whether it is or is not consistent with their own heart rate. So it's a way of being able to see whether people are sensitive to internal signals of their own heartbeat, kind of visceral awareness task. Long-term meditators are no different from controls on this, but the short-term meditators are. They have more correct responses than controls. So consistent with the short-term meditators having, again, greater attention to bodily states. We also looked at both actions, overt actions and cognitive actions in response to these emotional experiences. These can often be considered as ways of consequent emotional regulation. That is, after the emotion has already arisen, in contrast to antecedent things you do to regulate emotion before an emotionally salient event occurs. And it's not significant, but there was a trend, 0.08, for a difference between the groups where, again, the short-term meditators seem to be doing this more often. And you can see some examples, and they really do reflect ways in which persons, after an emotion arises, tries to do something to reduce the intensity of that emotion. We also looked at a measure of cardiac vagal tone. We're not going to have time to go through all the detail of why it is that this is thought to be a measure of interest in regard to emotion regulation. But for those of you who are interested, Steve Porges last year published a book on what he has called polyvagal theory, which lays this out quite nicely. The measure we take is based on a resting heart rate from 5 minutes in each of those two sessions. The first session right after the recalled emotional experience and interview, and then the second session without any such interview. It reflects parasympathetic influences on the variability of heart rate that occur through the vagus nerve, particularly the ventral aspect of the vagal nerve. There's two different components to the vagus, and you can think of it as being a way in which the nervous system is kind of putting the brakes on a number of physiologic components of emotional response. So when someone is regulating emotion, we're going to see more variability in heart rate because there's more putting on the brakes, releasing the brakes, putting on the brakes, releasing the brakes. So that's the logic behind it. Again, recorded twice at each of those sessions, and we use multiple measures of vagal tone or vagal control. These are all significantly but not perfectly intercorrelated one with another, and there's debate in the literature about what the best index for this is, whether or not you need to take into account respiration or not simultaneously. John Allen has done some very nice work on this here in our department, so we borrowed from him a variety of indices in a computer program he calls CMET for being able to look at this. So what we see, short-term meditators differed significantly from the other two groups on measures of vagal control for session 1. And we think of that as a stress condition. They're recalling an emotional experience. And we see that particularly for the law of RSA, respiratory sinus arrhythmia is what that stands for, as well as this cardiac vagal influence. No differences between the groups for the second session. And then when we compare the measures across sessions, we do find, as you might expect from this, significant group by session interaction, with the short-term meditators showing greater heart rate variability and vagal control following the stress condition than at rest. So how would I summarize what we've been observing? The short-term meditators, those with less than 10 years of meditation experience, appear to be paying more attention to emotion and show a strong positive relationship between that attention or interest in valuing of emotion and self-reported emotional clarity. They report more bodily feelings, tend toward more cognitive actions in their emotional experiences, and they exhibit greater vagal control or heart rate variability after an emotional stressor, may be due to an increased attention to emotion and the use of consequent emotion regulation effort. That is, again, after the emotion has arisen, not regulatory strategies that are antecedent, that precede or are early in the processing.
So cognitive action, is that like a like trying to make yourself
like
feel
a
better?
reappraisal.
Yeah, okay.
A reappraisal. Yeah. In contrast, the long-term meditators, those with more than 10 years of experience, they're the ones that report higher emotional clarity. Maybe not surprising because they're having a lot of practice of observing the body, observing as emotions arise, and being clear and non-judgmental in their perception of that. They don't differ from controls in their self-reported emotional experience, in their attention to emotion, or in their heart rate variability. Those who report higher clarity show lower physiologic and experienced arousal, greater subtle positive facial expression in response to these masked pictures, raising the question for us of whether they're engaging more in antecedent emotion regulation, very early in the processing of emotionally salient stimuli. Remember, these are masked, they're not accessible to conscious processing, and when we see these effects with masked stimuli, they've got to be occurring very, very early, first 45 milliseconds. That's all of the time that image is available. So it's kind of an interesting pattern. We see changes in one direction for the short-term meditators, changes in another direction that look more similar in some ways, at least for response to unmasked images and on some of the other measures for the long-term meditators. So I thought it was interesting to simply provide this quote from Wixin, who says, "For 30 years before I had penetrated Zen, when I saw mountains, they were mountains. When I saw rivers, they were rivers. Later, after I had intimately met my master and gained the entry point, when I saw mountains, they were not mountains. When I saw rivers, they were not rivers. But now, when I have attained the state of essential repose, when I see mountains, they're just mountains. When I see rivers, they're just rivers." So I think some awareness in historical, in this case, Chan, Buddhist practice from China, this kind of curvilinear response where it almost looks as though one has come back to where one started, but with some very interesting differences. So it raises some hypotheses for us, and I'll tell you about what we'd like to try to do in the future with all of this. Practice in quiescent attention to experience may enable a shift from attachment and reactivity to greater equanimity, but that transformation seems to occur over many years. This isn't something that happens rather quickly. So initially, perhaps attention to and awareness of bodily feelings, the use of cognitive actions to consequently regulate emotion, and physiologic reactivity to emotional stressors increase. And it may be of some interest that it's in this period of length of meditation practice that we often find reports of kind of dark night of the soul experiences, various kinds of emotionally difficult experiences. Later, clarity may increase and explicit attention to emotion might no longer be needed. The clarity might confer a kind of its own emotional regulatory skill, enabling one to be sensitive to the very beginnings of emotional response, happening very early upon confrontation with an emotionally salient event, and therefore conferring an emotional regulatory skill that happens antecedently. Attention to subtle emotion cues might become automatized or preconscious. It no longer requires a person to have to effortfully focus on their bodily and other emotion experience. And also it may be possible that appraised self-relevance might decrease. Remember that all emotion theoretically is an appraisal of an event as self-relevant. If it's not self-relevant, it doesn't arouse emotion. So if in practice, as is alleged, the self is deconstructed, it's seen to be empty, it may be that there's less appraisal of events as having any relevance to oneself, if oneself is not something that has much substance. So what do we want to do in the future? Well, one of the things we'd like to focus on is an examination of the time course of emotion response, because in fact, if we're right that these are things that in long-term meditators are happening very, very early in the course of processing stimuli, we ought to be able to see some reflection of that in ways that let us unpack the time course of response. And what I'm most interested in at the moment is an electrophysiologic approach that measures the emotion-related eye blink startle potentiation. What that's about, eye blink is a very rapidly occurring element of the startle reflex, one of the earliest components. If something startles you, one of the quickest responses is a strong eye blink. The magnitude of that startle eye blink, which we can measure with a little electrode on the orbicularis muscle, is dependent on the concurrent emotional state of an individual. So it's suppressed if there's a positive emotional state, and it's exaggerated or amplified if there's a negative emotional state in comparison with neutral. And that enhancement is thought to reflect a reflex that is mediated by amygdala projections to the brainstem, this system in the brain for monitoring self-relevant events in the world. And the inhibitory effect with positive emotion thought to reflect prefrontal cortex projections to the amygdala that basically put the brakes on it or inhibit it. So just to give you some idea of why we're interested in this particular response, show you some data from non-meditators. Our lab does a fair amount of aging work as well, so 34 young and 34 older individuals that we compared using this startle paradigm. And what we do is, while people are viewing, again, the same sort of categorizing into positive, neutral, or negative images, using the same kinds of images that I showed you before, but then while they are viewing or after they are viewing the image, we, in a randomized way, present startle probes, a very loud 90 decibel, 100 millisecond white noise, subjectively sounds a bit like a gunshot, at either 4 seconds into viewing the image, 5 seconds into viewing it, 300 milliseconds after the offset of the image, or several seconds after the offset of the image. And so what you see here is the reflection of what I was just telling you about in regard to this amplification or suppression of that blink response. At 4 seconds into viewing the image, both older adults and younger adults show this expected pattern. That is, in comparison to when viewing the neutral stimuli, when they're viewing a negative image, the magnitude of that blink response is increased. When viewing a positive image, it's inhibited. Okay? No difference in that pattern between the older and younger adults. However, once we get to 5 seconds, the younger adults are still showing the pattern, even though it's a little less robust than it is at 4 seconds. But the older adults are showing a reversal of that pattern. They're actually inhibiting the strength of that blink response to the negative images. They're also different at 300 milliseconds after stimulus offset. A typical kind of finding is that there's a general inhibition of the blink response, kind of a post-processing inhibition. Nonetheless, the young adults still show this proportional difference where there's less of that inhibition for the negative stimuli. The older adults, a different pattern. And then everybody demonstrates this kind of surprise phenomenon at several seconds after the image, where you get large responses regardless of what they had been viewing during the preceding interval. So older and younger adults show a different pattern of the startle potentiation in late image viewing and immediately after image offset. And we've been doing some writing about this recently. We think it may reflect different emotion regulation strategies in older and younger adults. Younger adults tend to, in a number of different kinds of experimental paradigms, show a negativity bias. That is, they attend more to emotionally negative stimuli. Probably adaptive. You need to be able to cope with and manage how you respond to challenging and threatening events. And those become very important in building the repertoires that we all develop for our adult relationships and occupational work. Older adults don't show that negativity bias, and in fact what they tend to show is a positivity bias. They pay more attention to that which is emotionally positive. And it is thought to reflect the response to a more limited future horizon. We're no longer preparing for things that are going to be happening in the future when you get to be my age. You're investing more of your energy and attention to things like close personal relationships and a small number of important people to you, and those things that bring positive response and comfort. And that tends to go along with such things as there's actually a lower incidence of new episodes of depression as we age. There is a greater degree of equanimity and a number of different ways of measuring that with older age. So, to finish up, some of the hypotheses we have using that kind of an approach, and some others that I won't talk about this evening, really tries to use stages of emotion processing as entry points where a meditative practice might be exerting an influence. So, one point is the pre-appraisal stage, before we're actually making some conscious judgment about what it is that's happening in the world and how it's relevant to self. Long-term practice may increase background emotional positivity, our baseline mood state, as well as approach tendencies. In other words, just as with aging, absent meditation practice may increase our positivity bias and or decrease negativity and avoidance. And it also may broaden attention to the full context of events that are beyond a focus on potential threats. There's evidence, although now some controversy about how to really interpret this, that at least for unpleasant emotional arousal tends to narrow our attentional focus. So, if somebody's got a gun in your face, you're not going to be able to attend to or remember what that gunman's face was, but you're most certainly going to pay a lot of attention to the gun itself. So, narrowing the focus to the threat stimulus. Meditation practice may, because of decreasing that negativity bias, broaden our awareness of the full context. At the appraisal stage itself, long-term practice might be enhancing pre-attentive perceptual clarity, how accurately and quickly we begin to detect the very first aspects of the body's response to a challenge or affordance. May decrease mistaken appraisal of threat. And the decreased focus on self could also decrease perceived personal relevance of events, and therefore less of the response that unfolds because it's less personally relevant. There's a stage of reappraisal, what happens after our initial response. Long-term practice might result in a decrease in iterative reappraisal, and therefore a faster return to equanimity. Iterative reappraisal, you're all familiar with, right? Well, the son of a bitch, over and over and over and over again. The development of attentional ability, the ability to disengage particularly from events, including mental events, may be relevant in decreasing that iterative reappraisal. Might also result may also increase the clarity and labeling of emotional experience, which could allow a more discerning engagement of these consequent or after arousal reappraisals. In other words, greater skillfulness in what it is we're actually going to use to reappraise the event itself. It may also be important to look at the interrelationships among emotion experience components. Again, in temporal sequence, practice may shift focus away from features of the world or the self as evaluated in light of our current concerns, and more toward the present sensory experience, including bodily experience. So more attention to the body, to our motivational state, to dispositional changes that result from our evaluation of the world or self itself. And we're limited capacity processing devices, so you can't be doing two kinds of things at the same time. If you're focusing attention on these bodily changes, you're not iteratively reappraising what's happening in the world or what I did, and making sense out of it in terms of your own need hierarchies, etc., could further contribute to a decrease in this reiterative reappraisal of concerned relevant events. So I want to end with some brief comments on some of the challenges we face in doing meditation and emotional research. One very significant one is the recruitment of short and long-term meditation practitioners that are homogeneous in their type of practice. Several of the students here who are interested in meditation research have come up against this problem repeatedly. People often shop around in their meditation practice. They may switch particular traditions. So unlike laboratories that focus on monastics who have lived in and trained in a particular tradition since a very early age, when we're doing work in the Western world where most practitioners are lay practitioners, this is a significant challenge because we think that different kinds of practice are variable in their impact upon emotion. They may do different sorts of things. Very significant challenge is securing funding for basic preclinical research. It's become easier the last decade to obtain NIH funding for disease-specific research on meditation, much less easy to get funding for basic research that's really necessary, I think, to understand the mechanisms of what is happening and therefore better understand what is going to be relevant to what clinical situation. Also a challenge of balancing the control that we have of laboratory research and these kinds of physiologic and other measurement approaches that I described, with the real risk of decontextualizing both the meditation and the lived emotional experience. Emotion we elicit in the lab is not the same as emotion that is elicited in our day-to-day life. Much of human emotion is elicited by social interaction. And that's social interaction that occurs over time and is reciprocal, and we're not modeling that very well in some of the kinds of laboratory tasks that I showed you. Nonetheless, they give us an advantage of controlling a lot of sources of variability. So it's always a dance between those two and trying to make sure we haven't so removed things from context that they no longer generalize to what really goes on when people practice meditation in their day-to-day lives. So that's all I wanted to say, and I'm happy to open it up for questions or comments.
So you still have the age factor in difference between your short-term and your long-term meditators.
They were equivalent on age. They were not different on age, and that's really important. And it's not sufficient to try to statistically control for that, because age itself is related to many of these things, and so you're washing out some of the baby with the bathwater when you partial the variance by age and then try to look at residuals. So yeah, really important, and that's a difficult challenge in and of itself, because there's a natural correlation between numbers of years of practice and age.
It seems like there would be you were saying, different types of practices, the lack of homogeneous groups.
Mm-hmm.
But even for a long-term or a short-term in the exact same practice, the variance inside that.
Yeah.
I mean, to suggest that if you and I both practiced for 10 years and we're the same age,
Right.
that we would progress the same way.
Yeah.
I would think there would be, for 100 people, there would be 100 different ways.
Absolutely.
And that would be a challenge.
Yeah, it's a very, very significant challenge. And we saw some of that, years of practice accounted for some amount of the variance in some things, but this clarity measure accounted for other amounts of the variance, and that may be a closer index to what's actually being experienced in the progression of one's practice. But we don't have ways, how do you index where someone is in their practice, given that so much of it is phenomenologically determined? And Now, there may be strategies of, particularly if you study people in monastic settings or who have been working with, all of whom working with a particular teacher for a long period of time, of figuring out ways to get teacher-rated indices of where someone is in their practice. But even that's dicey, we often say that, gaining mind is the enemy of meditation.
Sort of counterintuitive.
Yeah, sure. So that's a real problem. Thanks.
In addition,
Please.
wanted to comment on what crossed my mind as we were going through the data was that my generic way of describing it to myself was it looked like in the short term the awareness became keener almost because observation in your beginning of your meditation practice has to become keener before you can actually unattach of things, which it seemed that the results showed that there was a more ability to be unattached, although the clarity was there, which is the observation. The attachment was expressed as being more unattached, that you first have to almost become aware of what you're attached to before it becomes unattached.
Yeah.
I thought that was pretty fascinating.
Yeah, very good way of putting it, and that may be part of the necessary unfolding of the progress. But it may happen at different rates for different people.
Yeah.
Another challenge is what do we do with sudden insight, Kensho and Zen or things like that, and there's this much research on that. We just don't know. Are there really are there experiences that fundamentally shift this progression that I was looking at here, or are those just things that enhance your motivation and you still got to do all the day-to-day work and it unfolds over time?
Yeah, time for maybe just one or two more questions.
Okay.
When you were referencing possible differences among traditions of meditation and they're possibly having different results experimentally, were you basing that on a scientist's, well, we need to take a good look at possible differences across the board, or were you basing that also possibly on a hunch or observations? Or
It's all of those. So Zen and Vipassana have a number of similarities in the way in which meditation is practiced. Once you get into Vajrayana practices, and even within Vajrayana, enormous variability. So there are some practices that seem very particularly focused upon transformation of emotional response, visualization kinds of practices, imagining oneself to be a particular bodhisattva and all of that stuff. So that's where I just would want this kind of investigation to be careful not to mix those things together, where you might have you would expect some substantial differences. Okay, well, thank you all for being here this evening.